The day my parents asked me to invest my savings to save my sister Jessica's failing business was the day I realized blood doesn't guarantee fairness. I sat across from them at our family's oak kitchen table, the same one where I'd watched them celebrate Jessica's every achievement while my accomplishments went unnoticed, as they explained why I should do the right thing and help my struggling sister. Little did they know I had built something far more valuable than their family hardware store could ever be. A tech company valued at $20 million that no one in my family knew existed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I remember the morning everything began to unravel with perfect clarity. It was a brisk April day, the cherry blossoms just beginning to bloom outside my childhood home in Westridge. The soft pink petals contrasted sharply with the gray clouds that threatened rain later. Appropriate weather for what was about to unfold. I had driven 3 hours from the city for what I thought would be a normal Sunday family lunch, the first since my father's heart attack 2 months earlier. The drive had given me plenty of time to reflect on our family history. Growing up as the second daughter in the Donovan family had shaped me in ways both obvious and subtle. Jessica, the golden child, had always been groomed to take over the family business, while I was expected to find my own path, though preferably one that wouldn't outshine hers. Our parents had never explicitly stated this, but family dynamics rarely require verbal confirmation. As I pulled my car into the familiar curved driveway, memories washed over me. Summer evenings catching fireflies in mason jars. Winter mornings shoveling snow with my grandfather, who would tell me stories about starting the hardware business from nothing. Countless family dinners where Jessica's latest achievement was the main topic of conversation, my own news given cursory attention before moving on. These patterns had been established so early that for years I hadn't questioned them. The familiar, two-story colonial looked exactly as it always had. Meticulously maintained garden beds flanking the brick pathway, white trim freshly painted, blue door gleaming in the sunshine, just as my father had always insisted it should be. My mother's pride in their home was evident in every carefully tended rosebush and spotless window. When I pulled into the driveway, I immediately noticed Jessica's luxury SUV parked prominently near the entrance, a vehicle that seemed at odds with someone supposedly struggling to keep her business afloat. My modest sedan looked almost embarrassingly practical beside it, though ironically, I was the one who could afford much more. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror, tucking a strand of dark hair behind my ear and straightening my understated silver necklace. I'd deliberately chosen simple, quality clothes, dark jeans and a cashmere sweater that looked casual but cost more than most people would guess. It was part of the careful image I'd cultivated. Successful enough to be comfortable, but not so. Successful that family might start asking questions I wasn't ready to answer. As I approached the front door, voices drifted through the open windows. My parents and Jessica were deep in conversation, their tones hushed but intense. I hesitated, hand poised to knock, when I caught a fragment that made my blood run cold. "Michelle needs to step up," Jessica was saying, her voice carrying the same authoritative tone she'd used since childhood when telling me how things should be done. "She's single, no kids, minimal expenses. She has the savings to help save the family legacy." My mother's response was gentle but firm. "We'll talk to her when she arrives. I'm sure she'll understand once we explain the situation." I stood frozen. On the porch, a strange hollowness expanding in my chest. They were discussing me, or rather, what I owned. The modest savings account they knew about, which represented just a fraction of my actual wealth. I considered turning around, driving away, postponing this conversation until I felt more prepared. But I'd never been one to avoid difficult situations. That quality had served me well as I built DriveSync from a concept into a thriving business. though my family had no idea about any of it. Taking a deep breath, I knocked firmly on the door. The sound seemed to echo through the house, cutting off the conversation inside like a guillotine. The conversation inside abruptly ceased. Footsteps approached, and then my mother stood before me, her face arranged in a welcoming smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. At 62, she remained an attractive woman, her silver-streaked brown hair styled in the same practical bob she'd worn for decades. Today she wore a floral blouse and pearl earrings, her standard Sunday attire. "Michelle, darling, we were just talking about you," she said, embracing me with the faint scent of her signature perfume enveloping me momentarily. The familiar smell that had once meant comfort now felt cloying, almost suffocating. I could feel the tension in her shoulders, sense the anxiety beneath her pleasant demeanor. "I heard," I replied simply, stepping into the foyer. The house smelled of pot roast and fresh bread, my mother's standard offering for family discussions where she wanted compliance. It was amazing how predictable they all were, using the same tactics they'd employed throughout my childhood. Good. Food and family pressure had always been a powerful combination. Jessica appeared in the archway leading to the living room, her expression carefully neutral. At 38, 3 years my senior, she had always been the golden child, tall, and poised with our father's confident bearing and our mother's charm. Today she was impeccably dressed in designer clothes, a silk blouse and tailored slacks that probably cost more than a month's inventory for one of their struggling stores, a detail that didn't escape my notice given her supposed financial difficulties. Her hair was highlighted and styled, her nails freshly manicured. Everything about her projected success, despite the reality I knew lurked beneath the surface. "Hey, Mickey," she said, the childhood nickname feeling patronizing now. The diminutive form of Michelle had once been used affectionately, but somewhere in our teens, it had transformed into a subtle way of infantilizing me, keeping me in the role of little sister regardless of my accomplishments. "Good drive?" "Fine," I answered, tension already building between my shoulder blades. I could feel myself slipping into old protective patterns, voice calm, posture straight, but not confrontational, emotions carefully contained. "What were you three discussing about me before I arrived?" My directness had always been a source of contention in our family. My father had occasionally respected it. My mother and sister had always found it uncomfortable. It disrupted the carefully choreographed dance of polite conversation and unspoken expectations that governed our interactions. My mother sighed, gesturing toward the dining room. "Let's sit down. I've made your favorite pot roast, and we might as well address this now." The dining room was flooded with light from the bay windows overlooking the backyard. 4 places were already set at the table, suggesting they'd been waiting to have this conversation over a carefully orchestrated meal. Fine china and crystal water glasses, not the everyday dishes we used for casual Sunday lunches. This was a production, deliberately staged to create the right atmosphere for whatever they were about to ask of me. I took my usual seat, the chair, to the right of where my father would have sat at the head of the table. Jessica sat opposite me, while my mother took what had been my father's place, a subtle shift in family hierarchy that didn't go unnoticed. My father entered last, moving slowly with his cane, the recent heart attack having aged him considerably. His once robust frame seemed diminished somehow, his shoulders slightly stooped, his face lined with new creases of worry. Yet his presence was still commanding despite his physical frailty, and his eyes, always shrewd, assessed me carefully, as he lowered himself into the chair at the opposite end of the table. I felt a pang of genuine concern for him. Despite our complicated relationship, I didn't want to see him struggling with his health. "Michelle," my mother began, her hands clasped before her in the gesture I'd seen countless times, the one that signaled a serious family discussion was about to commence. "We need to discuss the family business." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What about it? I asked, leaving my water glass untouched. I thought everything was going well. This was a deliberate misrepresentation. I knew from industry contacts that Donovan's Hardware, the business my grandfather had started and my father had expanded into 3 locations, was struggling. Big box stores had moved into the area 5 years ago, and my parents and sister had failed to adapt to the changing market. But they didn't know I kept tabs on the business, despite having been effectively pushed out of any involvement a decade ago when Jessica was named the heir apparent. I had resources and connections they couldn't imagine, all carefully hidden behind the persona of moderately successful Michelle, the daughter who had gone her own way. As my father shifted uncomfortably in his chair and Jessica exchanged a meaningful glance with my mother, I braced myself for what was coming. This lunch wasn't about family connection or checking on my father's recovery. It was about money, my money, and their assumptions about what I owed the family legacy. Things have been challenging, my father admitted, his voice carrying less confidence than I remembered. The strong, decisive businessman who had dominated family discussions throughout my childhood seemed diminished somehow. He ran his weathered hand along the edge of the polished table, the same hands that had built the Donovan legacy store by store, the same hands that now trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass. The Westridge location is barely breaking even, and the newer stores are operating at a loss. I studied him carefully, noting the new lines around his eyes, the way his shoulders hunched forward slightly as if carrying an invisible weight. His heart attack had aged him certainly, but there was something more. The quiet desperation of a proud man watching his life's work crumble despite his best efforts. Despite my complicated feelings about the family business, seeing him this way stirred a protective instinct I hadn't expected to feel. My mother jumped in, her voice taking on the soothing tone she'd used throughout our childhood when explaining why Jessica's needs came first, why Jessica needed the new ballet shoes while my art classes could wait, why Jessica's college tuition justified the better school while I could make do with scholarships and loans. It was her mediator voice, the one that made unfairness sound reasonable, inevitable. Your sister has been working tirelessly to turn things around, she said, arranging her napkin perfectly in her lap, a nervous habit I recognized from tense family discussions past. She's developed a wonderful renovation plan to modernize the stores and expand our online presence. My mother's unwavering faith in Jessica had always been both impressive and frustrating. No matter the circumstance, no matter how clear the evidence of Jessica's missteps, our mother maintained her belief that her eldest daughter would ultimately prevail. It was a kind of blind loyalty I'd never experienced from either parent. Jessica nodded, leaning forward with the practiced sincerity she used when presenting ideas she wanted approved. The same expression she'd used when convincing our parents she needed a car at 16, or when persuading them to finance the 3rd store location despite the thin market research supporting expansion. Her pearl earrings caught the light as she tilted her head, a gift from our father when she had been named general manager over me despite my business degree. It's a comprehensive rebrand, she explained, her voice taking on the polished quality she used when addressing the Chamber of Commerce or local business gatherings. New layout, expanded inventory, digital integration, everything the consultants recommended. She was good at this, presenting a vision with confidence, making people believe in possibilities rather than current realities. It was a genuine talent, one I had grudgingly admired, even as it consistently overshadowed my more analytical approach. Sounds expensive, I observed, watching their expressions carefully. Jessica's briefly tightened around the eyes, a tell she'd had since childhood. When feeling defensive, my father shifted in his chair, and my mother's fingers tensed around her fork momentarily before relaxing into a deliberate casualness. It's an investment in the future, my father stated firmly, though the slight twitch in his left eye, his tell since childhood when stretching the truth, betrayed his uncertainty. He'd used the same phrase when expanding to the third location, a decision I had quietly opposed during my final months at the business. That investment had drained capital reserves just before the big box competitors arrived, leaving them vulnerable to exactly the situation they now faced. The spring sunlight streaming through the bay windows illuminated dust motes drifting lazily in the air, casting a golden glow over the dining room that belied the tension humming beneath our polite conversation. I could hear the distant chirping of birds outside, the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, sounds of normalcy providing an ironic backdrop to what was clearly a family emergency disguised as a casual lunch. The banks won't extend any more credit, Jessica admitted after a moment, breaking the brief silence. Her admission seemed to physically pain her. Admitting limitation had never come easily to her. They say retail hardware is too risky in the current market, especially with our recent performance. I bit back the urge to point out that I had predicted exactly this scenario years ago, when I'd advocated for establishing an e-commerce platform and diversifying beyond traditional hardware offerings. My suggestions had been dismissed as unnecessarily complicated and not understanding our core customer base. Now the same banks that had eagerly financed Jessica's expansion plans were pulling back, seeing what had been obvious to me long before. My mother reached across the table as if to take my hand, though I kept mine firmly in my lap, unwilling to be manipulated by the physical connection she often used to soften difficult requests. Her wedding ring caught the light, the same ring that had been promised to whichever daughter continues the family business, a not-so-subtle incentive that had been mentioned repeatedly as Jessica's ascension to management was finalized. "This is where family comes in, Michelle," she said, her voice warm but with an underlying firmness that suggested refusal wasn't an option she was considering. "Jessica has put everything she has into the business already. Your father and I have remortgaged the house. We need your help to save the family legacy." The word legacy hung in the air between us, that powerful concept that had been wielded throughout my childhood and young adulthood whenever my own interests diverged from family expectations. Legacy was why I should work weekends at the store, rather than joining the debate team. Legacy was why I should focus on business courses rather than my interest in computer science. Legacy was why Jessica's role as heir apparent shouldn't be questioned, despite my better qualifications. Now legacy was being invoked once again, this time to access my finances. "My help," I repeated, wanting to be absolutely clear about what they were asking. "You mean my money?" The bluntness of my statement created a momentary discomfort around the table. My mother's smile tightened slightly. My father's gaze dropped to his plate, and Jessica shifted in her chair, her designer bracelet clinking softly against the edge of the table. "It's not just money," Jessica interjected, a flash of irritation crossing her face before she smoothed it into concern, another familiar pattern from our childhood. Any direct challenge to her needs or wants would trigger an initial anger that she quickly masked with reasonableness. "It's about commitment to this family, to the business Grandpa built from nothing, that Dad expanded, that I've been working to preserve while you've been off doing whatever it is you do in the city." The dismissive wave of her hand toward my life's work almost made me laugh. The whatever it is she referred to was DriveSync Technologies, the automotive software company I'd founded 8 years ago after leaving the family business. What had started in my apartment with 2 college friends had grown into an industry leader in fleet management solutions, with over 120 employees and clients across 3 continents. Our software was revolutionizing how companies manage their vehicle fleets, reducing fuel consumption, optimizing maintenance schedules, and substantially cutting operational costs for businesses across multiple industries. None of them new. When I'd left Donovan's Hardware after Jessica had been promoted over me to general manager, despite my business degree and her lack of formal education, I'd told them I was taking an entry-level position at a tech startup. Over the years, as my company grew, I maintained the fiction of being a mid-level manager, allowing them to believe I was doing adequately but not exceptionally. I sent modest gifts at Christmas, contributed appropriately but not lavishly to family occasions, and maintained a deliberately unassuming lifestyle whenever I visited home. The irony wasn't lost on me. Jessica, who was drowning in business debt, drove a luxury vehicle and wore designer clothes she couldn't afford. I, who could purchase the entire Donovan's hardware chain with what amounted to pocket change, drove a practical sedan and shopped at mid-range stores when visiting family. Our external appearances perfectly matched the roles we'd been assigned in the family narrative. Jessica, the successful heir; Michelle, the adequate but unremarkable younger daughter who had gone her own way. "Exactly how much are you asking for?" I inquired, keeping my voice neutral despite the emotional currents swirling beneath the surface of this conversation. The carefully arranged pot roast sat largely untouched on my plate, the family meal a transparent pretext for what was essentially a business negotiation, though one based on profoundly flawed assumptions about the relative positions of everyone involved. My father cleared his throat, setting down his fork with deliberate care. "The full modernization plan requires about $350,000, he said, the figure clearly difficult for him to articulate. This was a man who had prided himself on building the business through disciplined reinvestment and careful expansion until Jessica had taken the helm. "We're asking you to contribute whatever you can, maybe $100,000 to start. We know you've always been good with saving." The amount was insignificant to me now, a rounding error in my company's quarterly budget. But the assumption stung. Yes, I lived modestly. A comfortable but not extravagant apartment, a reliable car, no ostentatious displays of wealth. That was by choice, not necessity. For years, I'd built my company in secret, wanting to succeed or fail on my own merits without my family's influence or judgment. I'd wanted validation for my ideas, my vision, my work ethic, not for the financial success that had resulted from them. What had started in my apartment had grown into something substantial, something I was fiercely proud of, with hundreds of employees whose livelihoods depended on my leadership. No one in my family knew. I'd kept it separate, partly because I wanted independence, and partly because I knew exactly what would happen if they found out, exactly what was happening now, even without that knowledge. As I looked at their expectant faces across the Sunday dinner table, I realized that a crossroads had arrived sooner than I had anticipated. The careful separation I had maintained between my family life and professional success was about to collapse, and the decisions I made in the coming days would permanently alter relationships that had been established over decades. "And if I contribute, what would my role be in this revitalization?" I asked, already knowing the answer, but wanting to hear them articulate it. I watched a silent communication pass between my parents and Jessica, a quick exchange of glances, laden with meaning, the kind of wordless family shorthand that develops over decades of shared history. I'd always been on the outside of these silent conversations, able to observe but rarely included. Jessica straightened almost imperceptibly in her chair, her shoulders squaring in the subtle way they did whenever she was about to assert her authority. A childhood habit that had evolved into a professional mannerism, it was so instinctive I doubted she was even aware of it. I remembered the same posture when she'd informed me, at 16, that she would be getting the car we'd both been promised, because she needed it more for her social obligations. "Well," my mother began delicately, her voice taking on the diplomatic tone that inevitably preceded disappointment for me. Jessica would continue as general manager, of course. She's been there consistently, knows all the customers and vendors. But we'd certainly welcome your input. My mother dabbed at the corner of her mouth with her napkin, a nervous gesture disguised as proper etiquette. She'd always been skilled at maintaining appearances, at transforming uncomfortable truths into palatable narratives. In her version of our family story, there was no favoritism, only different children with different needs receiving appropriate support. The fact that those different needs consistently prioritized Jessica was, in her worldview, merely coincidental. Translation: they wanted my money, not my expertise or involvement. Just as it had always been. The pattern was so familiar, it was almost comforting in its predictability. Throughout my childhood and early adulthood, I had been called upon to support Jessica's journey, to tutor her through difficult classes, to cover her shifts at the store when more exciting opportunities arose, to step back from opportunities that might have outshined her achievements. Now, as adults, the dynamic remained unchanged. My role was to provide resources and step aside, to bolster without challenging the established order. I glanced around the dining room as my mother spoke, taking in the familiar space where family decisions had always been made. The antique china cabinet still displayed my grandmother's wedding dishes, used only for holidays and special occasions. Family photos lined the sideboard in ornate silver frames. Jessica's graduation, Jessica's wedding, Jessica with my parents at the ribbon cutting. For the third store location, the only image of me was tucked in the corner, a decade-old photo from college graduation, my academic honors barely visible beneath the slightly dusty glass. This room held the history of our family dynamics in every carefully arranged detail. It was where Jessica had announced her engagement, where my father had proclaimed her the future of Donovan's hardware, where my suggestions for modernizing our inventory system had been repeatedly dismissed as unnecessary complications. The weight of these memories seemed to press down on me, the accumulated years of being secondary, of being the practical, reliable daughter whose greatest value lay in supporting others' ambitions. This isn't just about a cash injection, said, carefully choosing my words. The business strategist in me couldn't help analyzing their flawed approach, even as the daughter in me struggled with the familiar emotional undertow of family expectations. The business needs a complete strategic overhaul, not just cosmetic updates. My father frowned, the creases in his forehead deepening like canyons carved by years of worry. His expression reminded me painfully of the day I'd announced my intention to leave the family business. The same confusion, the same hint of betrayal, as if my desire for an independent path was incomprehensible within his worldview. "We have a strategy," he said, a defensive edge creeping into his voice. Jessica has been working with a retail consultant for months. Even in his diminished state, his instinct to defend Jessica remained strong. It had been this way for as long as I could remember, my father viewing Jessica as an extension of himself, the bearer of his legacy, while I remained something of an enigma to him. He understood Jessica's social nature, her people skills, her desire for recognition. My more analytical approach, my interest in systems and innovation, had always seemed to bewilder him slightly, as if I were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. Jessica nodded quickly, relief flashing across her face at our father's support. "We've developed a comprehensive plan. New layout, expanded inventory and high-margin categories, community workshops, to drive foot traffic. The analysis is solid." There was that word again, comprehensive, the same term she'd used when presenting her expansion plan for the third location, the one that had stretched their financial resources too thin just before market conditions deteriorated. Jessica had always been skilled at crafting presentations that sounded thorough, while glossing over potential risks or downsides. It wasn't deliberate deception, I reflected, but rather a genuine optimism that prevented her from fully engaging with worst-case scenarios or critical analysis. I picked up my water glass, taking a slow sip to buy myself time. The cut crystal caught the sunlight, sending tiny rainbows dancing across the white tablecloth. My grandmother's glasses, used exclusively for important family gatherings. Their appearance at lunch was yet another signal of how significant my parents considered this conversation. The truth was, I'd already seen their comprehensive plan. My college roommate now worked for the bank that held their business loans, and she'd discreetly shared their proposal when they'd been denied additional financing. Sarah had reached out to me, not just as a friend, but as someone with retail business knowledge, seeking my perspective on whether the bank was being too conservative. What she hadn't known was how personal the matter was for me. I'd spent a weekend analyzing the document, reading between the lines of optimistic projections and vague implementation strategies. The plan wasn't terrible, but it was insufficient, treating symptoms rather than addressing the fundamental shifts in the retail landscape. It proposed surface changes while ignoring the structural issues that had brought the business to this point: outdated supply chain management, inefficient staffing models, and most critically, a failure to develop meaningful digital integration in an increasingly online marketplace. And this plan addresses competition from Home Depot and Lowe's how exactly? I asked, setting down the glass with deliberate precision. Jessica's expression tightened, her perfectly shaped eyebrows drawing slightly together. The same expression she'd worn when I'd questioned the wisdom of opening the third location. We're focusing on personalized service and community integration, areas where the big boxes can't compete. With higher prices and lower inventory, I noted, the logistical reality impossible to ignore. The big box stores could purchase at volume discounts Donovan's could never match, creating a pricing disadvantage that no amount of personal service could fully overcome. Not everyone shops on price alone, my mother interjected defensively, her loyalty to Jessica's vision unwavering despite mounting evidence of its insufficiency. Our customers value relationship and expertise. It wasn't entirely wrong. There was indeed a segment of the market that prioritized knowledgeable service and community connection. But that segment was shrinking, not growing, and it couldn't sustain 3 store locations in a competitive environment. The data was clear, even if my family refused to see it. I glanced around the dining room as she spoke, taking in the familiar space where family decisions had always been made. The antique china cabinet still displayed my grandmother's wedding dishes. Family photos lined the sideboard: Jessica's graduation, Jessica's wedding, Jessica with my parents at the ribbon cutting for the 3rd store location. The only image of me was tucked in the corner, a decade-old photo from college graduation. This room held the history of our family dynamics in every carefully arranged detail. It was where Jessica had announced her engagement, where my father had proclaimed her the future of Donovan's hardware, where my suggestions for modernizing our inventory system had been repeatedly dismissed as unnecessary complications. The spring sunlight streaming through the windows illuminated dust motes floating in the air, giving the room an almost nostalgic glow. It was beautiful, familiar, and suffocating all at once. I felt the weight of family expectations pressing down on me, the unspoken assumption that I would once again step in to support Jessica's vision without substantive input or recognition. Looking at my father's tired face, I felt a complicated surge of emotions: frustration at the recurring patterns, genuine concern for his health and legacy, and a growing certainty that the time for half measures and polite evasions had passed. The business that had shaped all our lives was failing, and preserving it would require more than money. It would require truth about the market realities, about sustainable paths forward, and perhaps most difficult of all, about who I had become in the years since I'd left. The retail landscape has fundamentally changed, I said finally, my voice steadier than I expected given the emotional currents running beneath this conversation. Community workshops and friendly service won't be enough if your prices are 15% higher, and customers have to wait for special orders on basic items. I felt rather than saw Jessica tense across the table, her defensive posture so familiar I could predict it without looking directly at her. My mother's fingers worried at the edge of her napkin, a silent signal of her discomfort with direct confrontation. My father's face reddened slightly in the way it always did when his authority or judgment was questioned. "We've been in business for 45 years, he said, his voice carrying a warning note I recognized from childhood disagreements. "I think we understand our market." "And lost 30% of it in the last 3, I countered, the business analyst in me unable to retreat from factual reality, even as the dutiful daughter in me winced at challenging him so directly, especially given his health. Jessica pushed her plate away, the china making a slight scraping sound against the polished wood. She abandoned the pretense of a family meal, her body language shifting fully into business mode. Shoulders back, chin raised, the posture she adopted when feeling threatened professionally. "This is exactly why we don't include you in business discussions, Michelle," she said, her voice taking on the edge it always did when her authority was challenged. "You always think you know better than everyone else. Some theoretical knowledge from business school doesn't trump decades of hands-on experience." The irony of her statement hit me with almost physical force. My theoretical knowledge now included building a tech company from nothing to a $20 million valuation in less than a decade. Hardly an academic exercise. I had practical experience she couldn't imagine, managing complex supply chains, optimizing operations across multiple locations, developing digital integration strategies for companies far larger than Donovan's Hardware. But in the narrative of our family, I would always be the younger sister with book learning but no real-world wisdom, regardless of my actual accomplishments. "This isn't theoretical. It's mathematical," I replied, struggling to keep frustration from coloring my tone. "Your overhead is too high, your inventory turnover too low, and your online presence is practically non-existent in a world where 70% of purchase decisions start with digital research." The tension in the room thickened, becoming almost palpable in the spring sunlight that continued to stream obliviously through the windows. My mother reached for my father's hand, a subtle signal for him to remain calm. This was their practiced routine. Jessica would push, my father would bristle, and my mother would mediate, always finding a way to give Jessica what she wanted while making it seem like compromise. Outside, birds continued their cheerful chorus, oblivious to the human drama unfolding within these walls. A neighbor's lawnmower droned in the distance, the mundane soundtrack of suburban Sunday afternoon providing an ironic counterpoint to what had become a pivotal moment, not just for the family business, but for the carefully constructed boundaries I had maintained between my two lives for nearly a decade. "We didn't invite you here to critique the business," my mother said, her voice taking on the reasonable tone she used when steering conversations to her preferred outcome. Her hands smoothed an invisible wrinkle from the tablecloth, her wedding ring catching the light, the ring that symbolized family continuity, that was meant to be worn someday by the daughter who carried forward the Donovan legacy. "We invited you because this is a family matter. The business that put food on your table, clothes on your back, and paid for that fancy education needs help. Family helps family, Michelle. It's that simple." But it wasn't simple. Nothing about the Donovan family dynamics had ever been simple. Studied my father's face, noticing how much he'd aged since his heart attack. The strong jawline that had dominated family photos for decades seemed softer now, less defined. The confident posture that had commanded respect in business meetings had given way to a slight stoop. His hands, once steady and capable of fixing anything from leaky faucets to complex inventory problems, now trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass. Despite our differences, I still respected what he'd built. James Donovan hadn't started with much, just determination and a good head for practical solutions. My grandfather had started with a single small hardware store, and my father had grown it into a respected local chain through decades of 7-day work weeks, careful expansion, and personal customer service. He'd worked hard, sacrificed much. That the business was failing wasn't entirely his fault. Market forces were challenging even the most adaptable retailers. The memories came unbidden. Standing on a step stool at age 8, learning to operate the ancient cash register while my father patiently explained the importance of accuracy and customer trust. Riding with him to supplier warehouses on Saturday mornings. Listening as he negotiated terms with the easy confidence of someone who knew his business inside out. The pride in his eyes when I'd developed a spreadsheet system at 16 that had streamlined their inventory management, reducing overstock by nearly 15% in the first quarter of implementation. That pride had dimmed when I'd chosen business school over immediately joining the family business full-time. It had faded further when I'd questioned the wisdom of rapid expansion and had disappeared entirely when I'd left after Jessica's promotion to general manager. In its place had grown a kind of bewildered disappointment, not anger, which might have been easier to bear, but a fundamental incomprehension of my choices that created a gap neither of us seemed able to bridge. Jessica's role in the decline was more complicated. She wasn't incompetent, far from it. Her people skills were exceptional. Customers loved her. Vendors enjoyed working with her. And she had a natural talent for making people feel valued and understood. These were genuine business assets in a local retail operation. What she lacked was adaptability and analytical foresight. She was resistant to change and overly confident in approaches that had worked in the past. Her attachment to being right often prevented her from making necessary adjustments or acknowledging when strategies weren't working. I recognized the irony that these were the same criticisms she often leveled at me. "I need time to think about this," I said finally, buying myself space to consider options. The weight of the situation, my father's health, the employees' livelihoods, my own carefully separated worlds on the verge of collision, demanded thoughtful consideration rather than an impulsive response. Jessica's face fell slightly. She had expected immediate agreement, as she'd received her entire life. The pattern was so familiar. Jessica makes a request. The family rallies to fulfill it. My deviation from this script was clearly unsettling to her. "There's really nothing to think about," she insisted, a note of impatience entering her voice. The slight flush on her cheeks betrayed her frustration. Another childhood tell I remembered from games of Monopoly when the outcome didn't favor her. Either you care about the family legacy, or you don't. The emotional manipulation was so familiar, it almost made me smile. From childhood, any hesitation to go along with Jessica's plans was framed as disloyalty to the family. It was a remarkably effective tactic, one that had shaped countless family decisions over the years. "Want to take art classes instead of working extra shifts at the store? Why don't you care about the family business? Questioning the timing of the third store opening? Why are you undermining our family's growth opportunity?" The pattern was so predictable, it had become almost comforting in its consistency. "It's not about loyalty," I replied, feeling something shift inside me. A clarity, a certainty that had been building for years, crystallizing in this moment of confrontation. "It's about sustainability. If I invest in a failing strategy, the money disappears and solves nothing. That helps no one." I watched my words land around the table, my mother's fingers stilled on her napkin, her eyes widening slightly at my direct challenge to the family script. My father's gaze sharpened, some of his old business acumen momentarily overriding his emotional attachment to Jessica's leadership. And Jessica herself, her expression cycling rapidly through shock, anger, and finally a calculating assessment as she recalibrated her approach. "So now you're a business expert?" Jessica scoffed, her voice carrying the dismissive tone she'd perfected over years of establishing her position as the family authority. "Based on your mid-level tech job?" There it was, the diminishment I'd come to expect, the reflexive reduction of my professional life to something negligible, unthreatening to the established order. In Jessica's worldview, reinforced by years of family dynamics, I was playing at business while she was doing the real work of continuing the family legacy. For a brief, tempting moment, I considered revealing everything. The truth about DriveSync, about my actual position and accomplishments, about the financial resources that made their request for $100,000 almost laughably modest. The look on their faces would be momentarily satisfying, a validation I'd denied myself for years. But that satisfaction would be fleeting, quickly overtaken by the complex renegotiation of family relationships that would inevitably follow. This wasn't the moment for such revelations. It needed to be handled strategically, not reactively. My mother shot Jessica a warning glance. Even she recognized that alienating me completely might jeopardize getting what they wanted. "What your sister means," she interjected smoothly, falling into her lifelong role as family diplomat, "is that this is about more than just business. It's about family history, community presence, your father's legacy." My mother's skills as a mediator had preserved family harmony through countless potentially divisive situations over the years. With a well-placed comment here, a strategic change of subject there, she had maintained the surface appearance of familial unity, while never fundamentally challenging the underlying patterns. It was a delicate balancing act, one I had stopped appreciating once I recognized how it consistently maintained the status quo at the expense of genuine resolution. I looked between them, suddenly seeing the situation with painful clarity. This meeting wasn't the spontaneous family gathering they'd presented it as. They had decided their approach before I arrived, probably rehearsed the key talking points. The strategic placement of my favorite meal, the calculated emotional appeals, the coordinated responses to potential objections. In their minds, this wasn't a discussion but a formality. They expected me to acquiesce, as I often had throughout my life when faced with the united front of my parents and sister. The moment stretched between us, filled with unspoken expectations and long-established patterns. Through the window, I could see the old maple tree where my grandfather had built me a swing as a child. Behind it stood the garage where I'd spent countless hours helping him repair lawnmowers and screen doors before the business expanded beyond our home property. The memories were so vivid I could almost smell the mixture of motor oil and sawdust that had perpetually clung to my grandfather's clothes, could almost hear his patient voice explaining how each tool had its purpose, how understanding the function of each component was essential to fixing the whole. This place held my history too, though my family rarely acknowledged it. The hardware business wasn't just Jessica's inheritance. It had been in my blood since I was old enough to count inventory and make change for customers while standing on a step stool at the register. My connection to Donovan's hardware wasn't just financial or obligatory. It was emotional, personal, woven through my earliest memories and formative experiences. Perhaps that's why I had succeeded in building DriveSync. I'd grown up understanding business fundamentals, customer service, and the value of practical solutions to real problems. My grandfather's methodical approach to troubleshooting, my father's emphasis on relationship building, even my mother's diplomatic navigation of competing interests, all had shaped my approach to technology and leadership, even as I'd moved into an entirely different industry. The lessons learned at Donovan's Hardware had provided the foundation for everything that followed, though in ways my family couldn't recognize because they remained fixed on the surface divergence of our paths rather than the underlying connections. "I'll give you my decision next week," I said, rising from the table. It wasn't what they wanted to hear, but I needed distance to think clearly about what to do next, about how to help the business while breaking the unhealthy patterns that had brought it to this crisis point. My father looked disappointed, the hopes he'd placed in this carefully orchestrated family meeting clearly unfulfilled. Jessica's expression was a mixture of frustration and disbelief, her certainty in her ability to persuade me shaken by my unexpected resistance. My mother was already calculating, her eyes slightly unfocused as she planned how to approach me differently to get the desired result. "You'll call?" my mother asked, the casualness of her tone belied by the slight tension around her eyes. "Or come for dinner again, midweek, perhaps?" "I'll call," I confirmed, knowing that another in-person discussion so soon would likely devolve into a more direct form of emotional manipulation. I needed clarity, not heightened family pressure. I said my goodbyes, declining offers of leftovers and deflecting questions about my plans for the rest of the weekend. As I walked to my car, the spring air felt unexpectedly fresh after the emotionally charged atmosphere of the dining room. Birdsong and distant lawnmowers created an incongruously peaceful soundtrack for my racing thoughts. As I drove home that evening, my hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, the familiar roads blurring before me as I replayed the conversation. The entitlement, the assumptions, the familiar dynamics of being considered less important than Jessica. It all swirled in my mind along with more complex emotions. Concern for my father's health, genuine worry about the employees who depended on the business, and lingering attachment to my family's legacy. I passed landmarks that measured my journey away from Westridge, the high school where I'd first developed my interest in systems and technology, the small business district where I'd worked summer jobs to save for college, the community college where I'd taken night classes in programming while still working part-time at Donovan's. Each represented a step in my gradual divergence from the path that had been expected of me, small decisions that had cumulatively led to a life my family couldn't imagine. For years, I'd kept my success separate from my family life, wanting validation. That wasn't tied to financial achievement. I'd craved their respect for who I was, not what I owned. The psychological barriers I'd constructed between my two worlds had served their purpose, allowing me to build something on my own terms, without the weight of family expectations or comparisons. But as the highway stretched before me, I realized I'd been protecting people who wouldn't do the same for me. Maybe it was time the truth came out. Maybe it was time they learned that the daughter they thought needed to sacrifice her savings to save her sister's failing management had built something more valuable than they could imagine, and had done it entirely on her own. As I merged onto the interstate heading back toward the city, I felt a surprising lightness. Not a resolution to the immediate problem of Donovan's hardware, but a personal clarity about the need to integrate the divided aspects of my life. The successful business leader and the dutiful younger daughter couldn't remain separated indefinitely, not when circumstances were forcing them into direct confrontation. I wasn't sure exactly how I would approach the revelation of my true professional identity, but I knew with increasing certainty that the time for that revelation had arrived. The careful boundaries I had maintained between my worlds were about to dissolve, for better or worse. Now it's about protecting what we've built. My family has patterns. Jessica has always been the golden child, the future of the family business. If they knew about DriveSync, the dynamics would shift in ways that might not be healthy for anyone. Eliza nodded slowly. But circumstances are forcing your hand. Exactly. I've been thinking about buying them out completely. Her eyes widened, slightly. Bold move. How would that work? I haven't figured out all the details yet, but rather than just investing enough to keep their flawed strategy afloat, I could acquire the business, implement proper modernization, and preserve both the legacy and the jobs. And your role? Would you run it? I shook my head. No. DriveSync is my focus. I'd bring in professional management, provide strategic direction, but maintain separation day to day. And your family? That was the more complicated question. That's what I'm still figuring out. Our conversation was interrupted by a notification on my phone, a text from Jessica. Need your decision by Friday. Meeting with potential investors who might take your place if you're not interested in keeping things in the family. The emotional manipulation was so transparent it almost made me laugh. There were no other investors. I knew because I'd had a financial analyst friend discreetly review their books. No rational investor would put money into the business without significant changes to management and strategy. They're getting desperate. I told Eliza, showing her the text. Sounds like it's time to make a decision, she replied. Whatever you choose, the team and I have your back. Her support meant more than she knew. At DriveSync, I had built not just a company, but a community of people who valued competence, innovation, and genuine collaboration. The contrast with my family dynamics couldn't have been starker. After our meeting, I retreated to my office to focus on the decision ahead. The space reflected my personal philosophy, functional and comfortable without being ostentatious. The standing desk held dual monitors displaying real-time metrics from our various departments. Behind it, shelves contained technical manuals, business books, and a few carefully chosen mementos, The first check we'd received from a client, framed, a model of the delivery truck that had inspired our original fleet management software, a photograph of our team celebrating our 100th client. Nothing from my family adorned these shelves. No childhood photographs, no holiday snapshots, no proud displays of Donovan's hardware memorabilia. This space belonged to Michelle Donovan, CEO and founder, not Mickey, Jessica's less favored younger sister. As I considered my options, I pulled up the most recent financial reports on Donovan's hardware that my contact at the bank had provided. The situation was worse than my family had admitted. Without significant intervention, they had perhaps 6 months before they'd need to close at least one location. My father's health complicated matters. The stress of watching his life's work crumble couldn't be good for his recovery. And despite our differences, I didn't want to see him suffer. Then there were the employees, about 40 across the 3 locations, many of whom had been with the company for decades. People like Walter, who had taught me how to cut keys when I was barely tall enough to see over the counter, or Diane, who had managed the office since before I was born. They didn't deserve to lose their livelihoods because of Jessica's mismanagement or my parents' blind spot regarding her capabilities. I opened my laptop and began drafting an acquisition proposal. Not the $100,000 Band-Aid my family had requested, but a complete buyout that would give them financial security while allowing me to implement the changes necessary to save the business. The numbers came together quickly. I'd been unconsciously planning this longer than I'd admitted to myself. The business was worth about $1.2 million on paper, but given its current trajectory and debt load, a fair market offer would be closer to $900,000. I would offer $1.1 million, generous enough to provide my parents with retirement security and give Jessica a soft landing, but still a sound business decision given the potential for revival with proper management. As I worked through the details, I received another text, this time from my mother. "Your father's not feeling well. The stress is affecting his heart. We need to resolve this situation soon. Family dinner Sunday, another manipulation tactic, though I had no doubt my father's health concerns were real. What they didn't understand was that their preferred solution, my investment without control, would only prolong the inevitable while depleting resources that could be used for a more sustainable approach. I confirmed I would attend Sunday dinner, then continued refining my proposal, adding projections for the business under new management, strategic recommendations for the first year, and a transition plan that would preserve jobs while implementing necessary changes. By the time I left the office that evening, the acquisition plan was complete, detailed, fair, and designed to honor my family's legacy while facing business realities honestly. I had also made a personal decision. It was time to reveal the truth about DriveSync. Not out of a desire to prove myself or change long-established family perceptions, though those might be side effects, but because continuing the fiction had become more complicated than simply living my truth. As I drove home to my apartment, comfortable but modest compared to what I could afford, I mentally prepared for the conversation ahead. Sunday would mark a turning point, not just for Donovan's hardware, but for my relationship with my family. After years of separation between my personal and professional lives, the boundaries were about to dissolve. The thought was both liberating and terrifying. I had built DriveSync partly to escape the shadow of family expectations, to create a space where I was valued for my actual contributions, rather than measured against Jessica's reflected glory. Now those worlds would collide, with unpredictable results. "Time to own your success," I told myself, echoing words Eliza had said to me years ago when I'd been reluctant to step into a more public role as CEO. She had been right then, and the principle applied now as well. My success wasn't something to hide or apologize for. It was the result of vision, hard work, and the courage to chart my own path. Sunday would change everything. I was finally ready. Sunday arrived with unseasonable warmth, the kind of perfect. spring day that seemed deliberately staged for significant life events. I had spent Saturday finalizing my proposal and preparing mentally for what would undoubtedly be a challenging family conversation. Instead of my usual casual attire for family gatherings, I dressed deliberately in what Eliza called my investor meeting outfit, a tailored navy pantsuit, subtle platinum earrings, and the Patek Philippe watch I'd bought to celebrate our first million in revenue but rarely wore around my family. The effect was polished but not flashy, the appearance of a successful executive, not someone trying to flaunt wealth. I had the acquisition documents professionally bound and tucked into a leather portfolio. Additionally, I brought a USB drive, containing a presentation about Drive Sync, our growth trajectory, client list, recent valuation, and management team. I wasn't planning a formal slideshow, but I wanted the information readily available if questions arose. The drive to my parents' home felt different this time. Rather than the usual mild dread of enduring another session of Jessica-centered family dynamics, I felt a strange calm, the kind that comes with having made a decision after long deliberation. When I arrived, I noted that Jessica's SUV was already there, along with an unfamiliar sedan that I soon discovered belonged to her husband, Robert. His presence was unexpected. He typically avoided family business discussions, preferring to maintain distance from what he called Donovan drama. My mother answered the door, her practiced smile faltering slightly when she noticed my formal attire. "Michelle, you're looking very professional today." "Thought I'd come straight from the office," I replied, the small lie easier than explaining my real reasons. Inside, the scene was Michelle. My father nodded, using my full name. "Good to see you, dear." Jessica's eyes narrowed slightly as she took in my appearance. "Important meeting today?" she asked, her tone suggesting suspicion. "Something like that," I replied, setting my portfolio on the coffee table and taking a seat in the chair opposite my father. "I see the whole family's assembled. I'm guessing this isn't just about pot roast." My mother emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Dinner will be ready in about 20 minutes. We thought we might discuss the business situation first, so we can enjoy our meal afterward." The implied optimism that the discussion would be resolved quickly and to their satisfaction was typical. In my mother's worldview, family disagreements were temporary inconveniences to be efficiently managed, rather than fundamental differences to be genuinely addressed. "That sounds sensible," I agreed. "Actually, I've prepared something that might help frame our discussion." I reached for my portfolio, but Jessica jumped in before I could open it. "Before we get into details," she said, leaning forward with the earnest expression she used when making sales pitches, "I want to make sure we're all aligned on what's at stake here. This isn't just about a business. It's about our families, legacy, Dad's life work, and our responsibility to the community." Robert, a quiet, analytical type who worked in insurance, shifted uncomfortably beside her. I'd always suspected he saw through more of Jessica's performances than he let on. "I understand what's at stake," I said evenly. "That's why I've spent the past week conducting a thorough analysis of the situation." My father's eyebrows rose slightly. "Analysis? Based on what information?" It was time for the first revelation. "I've reviewed your financial statements from the past 3 years, the current debt structure, inventory turnover rates by category, staffing costs, and market positioning, relative to competitors." A moment of stunned silence followed. "How did you access our financial records?" Jessica demanded, color rising in her cheeks. "I have contacts in the industry," I replied, deliberately vague. "The important point is that I now have a clear picture of the business situation, which appears significantly more dire than what you presented last week." My father's face had gone slightly pale, while my mother's lips pressed into a thin line. Her tell when she was caught off guard and scrambling to regain control of a situation. "Those records are confidential," Jessica insisted. "You had no right." "Jessica," my father interrupted, his voice quiet but firm. Let's hear what Michelle has to say. If she's taken the time to analyze our situation, we should at least listen. This was unexpected. My father rarely contradicted Jessica, particularly in business matters. Perhaps his recent health scare had shifted his perspective more than I'd realized. Thank you, I said, opening my portfolio. Based on my analysis, Donovan's hardware needs much more than a $350,000 investment to remain viable. Without comprehensive restructuring, even that amount would only extend your runway by perhaps 6 months. I laid out the key issues succinctly. Outdated inventory management leading to cash flow problems, ineffective pricing strategies against big-box competitors, failure to develop meaningful online presence, and inadequate marketing to younger homeowners who represented the future customer base. As I spoke, the atmosphere in the room shifted. My parents exchanged glances, their planned script clearly derailed. Jessica alternated between defensive note-taking and attempting to interject with counterpoints that I calmly addressed with specific data. Robert, interestingly, was nodding along with several of my observations. This is all very analytical. My mother finally cut in, but it doesn't address the immediate need. We called you here because we need to know if you're willing to help your family in this crisis. All these business theories don't change that basic question. It was the opening I needed. Actually, I have a comprehensive solution to propose, I replied, removing the bound acquisition document from my portfolio and placing it on the coffee table. I'm prepared to acquire Donovan's hardware outright for $1.1 million. The silence that followed was absolute. Jessica stared at the document as if it might explode. My father leaned forward slightly, confusion evident in his expression. My mother was the first to recover. Acquire? Michelle, we're not selling the business. We're looking for an investment partner. A minority, silent partner, Jessica added pointedly. I understand that was your preference, I acknowledged. However, based on my analysis, partial investment without structural change would simply delay inevitable failure. My offer represents the most viable path to preserving both family financial security and the business itself. This is absurd, Jessica said, her voice rising. You can't possibly have that kind of money. And even if you could somehow get financing, what do you know about running a retail operation? You work in middle management at a tech company. The moment had arrived sooner than I'd anticipated. I met my sister's gaze steadily. I'm not in middle management, Jessica. I'm the founder and CEO of DriveSync Technologies. We currently employ 127 people, serve clients across 3 continents, and our most recent valuation puts the company at approximately $20 million. The room seemed to tilt slightly as my words registered. My father's mouth literally dropped open. My mother froze, water glass halfway to her lips. Robert looked between Jessica and me, a complex mix of emotions crossing his face. Jessica recovered. First, disbelief hardening into something closer to anger. That's not possible. You would have told us. There would have been something. Articles, announcements, something we would have seen. We've deliberately maintained a low media profile, focusing on industry recognition rather than general press, I explained. But if you'd like verification, I reached for my phone, pulled up the DriveSync website, and handed it to my father. He scrolled slowly through the executive team page, stopping at my professional photograph and biography. His expression shifted through confusion, disbelief, and finally something I couldn't quite identify. Pride, perhaps, or regret. 7 years, he murmured, looking up at me. You've been building this for 7 years and never said a word. 8. Actually, I corrected gently. I started developing the software before I left Donovan's. My mother set her water glass down carefully, the small sound unnaturally loud in the stunned silence. I don't understand, she said finally. Why would you keep something like this from your family? It was the question I'd anticipated, though hearing it aloud still caused a twist of emotion I hadn't fully prepared for. The hurt in her voice seemed genuine, which complicated the narrative I'd constructed over the years. That my family simply hadn't cared enough about my career to notice its trajectory. It wasn't a single decision, I explained, choosing my words carefully. When I first started DriveSync, I wasn't sure it would succeed. By the time we gained traction, keeping my professional life separate had become comfortable. Comfortable, Jessica repeated, her voice flat. She was scrolling through the DriveSync website on her phone now, her expression unreadable. You're telling us you built a multi-million-dollar company in secret because it was comfortable not to mention it? My father was still studying my face, as if seeing me clearly for the first time in years. There's more to it than that, he said quietly. It wasn't a question. I looked directly at him, appreciating his insight. Despite our differences, my father had always been perceptive about people's underlying motivations, even when his parental blind spots prevented him from applying that perception evenly between his children. Yes, I acknowledged. When I left Donovan's, it was made clear that I was walking away from the family legacy. Jessica was the future of the business. My decision to pursue technology was treated as a rejection of everything we had built. That's not fair, my mother interjected. We supported your choice to try something different. You tolerated it, I corrected. But there's a difference between tolerance and support. When I would mention challenges or opportunities at work, the subject would quickly shift back to the hardware stores. My career became an afterthought, something mentioned briefly before, moving on to important family matters. Jessica set her phone down, her initial shock hardening into defensive anger. So this was, what? Some elaborate revenge plot? Hiding your success to punish us for not giving you enough attention? No, I said firmly. It was about creating something that would be evaluated on its own merits, not measured against family expectations or filtered through existing dynamics. DriveSync became my space to lead, innovate, and succeed, based solely on the value we created. Robert, who had remained quiet during the initial revelation, unexpectedly spoke up. I think I understand, he said, ignoring Jessica's sharp glance. It's like how I keep my marathon training separate from family gatherings. The moment something becomes a topic of family discussion, it gets absorbed into existing patterns. It was perhaps the most insightful thing I'd ever heard Robert say, and it made me wonder how much he had observed about our family dynamics from his position as an in-law, involved, but with an outsider's clarity. Exactly, I agreed. Once something enters the family conversation, it's no longer just yours. It becomes subject to everyone else's opinions, expectations, and judgments. My father leaned back in his chair, wincing slightly with the movement. The conversation was clearly taking a toll on him, but his eyes remained sharp and focused. All of this is very psychological, he said, gesturing between us. But it doesn't address the immediate situation. You've built something impressive. Michelle, I can see that now. But what does that mean for Donovan's hardware? For your mother and I? For the legacy my father started? It was time to refocus on the business proposition. I opened the acquisition document and slid it toward him. My offer is straightforward. I'll purchase the business at above market value, providing you and Mom with financial security for retirement. Jessica would receive a fair severance package, and all current employees would be retained through the transition period, with performance-based opportunities to continue long-term. Severance package? Jessica repeated, her voice rising. You're talking about firing me from my own family's business? I'm talking about new management with retail experience and digital integration expertise, I clarified. The current leadership approach hasn't adapted to market changes. That's not a personal criticism. It's a business reality reflected in your financial statements. My mother placed a restraining hand on Jessica's arm, her own expression troubled. This is all very sudden, Michelle. You've clearly been planning this for some time, while we're just now learning about everything. We need time to process. Of course, I agreed. The offer isn't a today-only proposition. Take a week to review the details. Consult with your financial advisors. I'm also open to discussing modifications to the structure. Modifications, my father repeated, opening the document and scanning the executive summary. Such as? The purchase price is firm, but we could discuss transition timelines, potential advisory roles, or even establishing a family foundation that preserves the Donovan name in the community while separating it from the retail operation. Jessica stood abruptly. I need some air, she announced, and walked out the front door without waiting for a response. Robert remained seated, looking uncomfortable but making no move to follow her. My mother watched her go, then turned to me, with a mixture of confusion and concern. I don't think you understand what you're doing to your sister, Michelle. This business is her entire identity. She's devoted her life to it. I understand completely, I replied, careful to keep accusation out of my tone, but devotion doesn't automatically translate to successful stewardship. The business is failing despite her efforts. Those are just facts. My father closed the acquisition document and placed it carefully on the table between us. You've certainly given us a lot to think about, he said, his voice betraying fatigue. More than just the business offer. Finding out about DriveSync, about this whole life you've built without sharing it with us. It's a lot to absorb. The regret in his voice seemed genuine, which caught me slightly off guard. I had prepared for defensiveness, anger, even dismissal of my accomplishments. The hint of sadness, of missed connection, was harder to navigate. I know, I acknowledged, and I'm sorry for the shock. That wasn't my intention. What was your intention? Robert asked suddenly. With the reveal today, I mean. You could have continued keeping DriveSync separate while still making an offer for the business. It was an insightful question that cut to the heart of my decision-making process. Transparency, I said after a moment. Moving forward, I want business decisions to be based on reality, not assumptions or family myths. That starts with everyone understanding who I actually am professionally and what resources I bring to the table. Resources, my mother repeated, a slight edge entering her voice. So we've moved from asking for your help to becoming resources for you to allocate. That's not what I meant, I began, but she continued. You've clearly done very well for yourself, Michelle, and that's wonderful. But family businesses aren't just about balance sheets and market positioning. They're about people and relationships and history, things your spreadsheets can't quantify. It was a perspective I'd anticipated, one that revealed the fundamental difference in how we viewed the situation. To my mother, the business was primarily a social entity, a vehicle for family roles and community identity. The financial reality was secondary, a problem to be managed rather than the core issue to be addressed. Before I could formulate a response that might bridge this conceptual gap, the front door opened and Jessica returned. Her eyes were slightly red, but her composure had been restored. She walked directly to the acquisition document, picked it up, and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. I'd like to review this properly, she said, her tone carefully professional. With our attorney present, can we schedule a formal meeting for later this week? The shift in approach surprised me. I had expected continued emotional resistance, not a business-like pivot to procedural next steps. Of course, I replied. My schedule is flexible. Just let me know when and where. Jessica nodded curtly, then turned to our parents. Mom, I think I'm going to take this home to study. Robert and I will join you for dinner another time. My mother looked between us, clearly thrown by the sudden change in plans. But I've made all your favorites. I'm sorry, Jessica cut in, gathering her things. I need to focus on this right now. Professional to professional. she added with a glance toward me that contained both challenge and something else, perhaps a grudging reassessment. After Jessica and Robert departed, an awkward silence settled over the living room. My mother disappeared into the kitchen, presumably to deal with the now excess dinner preparations. My father and I remained, regarding each other across the coffee table that now held only my portfolio and his half-empty water glass. "So," he said finally, "a technology CEO." "Yes," I confirmed, uncertain how to interpret his tone. "Enterprise software for fleet management and logistics optimization." My father nodded slowly, processing. "And it's worth $20 million. He said the figure as if testing how it felt in his mouth, the concept clearly difficult to reconcile with his understanding of me. "That's our current valuation," I clarified. "It's a measure of market position and growth potential, not liquid assets." The company itself generated about $4 million in revenue last year. He leaned forward slightly, wincing as he adjusted his position. "Tell me about it. How did you start? What does it actually do?" The request caught me off guard. In all our years of family gatherings, my father had never asked detailed questions about my work. His interest had always been polite but perfunctory. How things were going? Was I enjoying it? Did I have job security? Never delving into the substance of what I actually did. "Are you sure?" I asked. "It's fairly technical." "I'm not dead yet." "Michelle," he said dryly, "I think I can still comprehend a business model, even if it involves computers." I couldn't help but smile at that. My father's gruff pragmatism had always been one of his more endearing qualities, even when it frustrated me. "All right," I said, settling back in my chair. It started while I was still at Donovan's, actually. I noticed how much time was wasted, tracking down delivery vehicles, scheduling maintenance, and optimizing routes. The existing software was clunky and designed for massive operations, not mid-sized businesses. As I explained how I'd developed the initial concept, coded the prototype myself while taking night classes in software development, and eventually connected with Ryan and Eliza to form the core leadership team, I was surprised by my father's engaged attention. He asked intelligent questions about scaling challenges, customer acquisition strategies, and our competitive advantage against larger players in the market. "So you identified an inefficiency and built a solution," he summarized when I finished. "Just like Grandpa did when he realized local builders were wasting half a day driving to the city for supplies." The comparison startled me. I'd never considered the parallel between my grandfather's entrepreneurial insight and my own. "I suppose there are similarities," I acknowledged. My father looked at me thoughtfully. "You have more of him in you than I realized. That same quiet determination. The ability to see problems others miss." Something shifted in the space between us. Not a complete reconciliation, but a subtle realignment, as if we were seeing each other more clearly after years of looking through distorted lenses. My mother returned from the kitchen, her expression still strained but composed. "Dinner." "We'll keep," she announced, though I wish Jessica hadn't left so abruptly. It's not like her to walk away from a family discussion. It was exactly like Jessica to walk away when situations didn't conform to her expectations, but I chose not to point this out. Instead, I picked up my portfolio, preparing to continue our conversation about the acquisition offer. "Before we get back to business matters," my mother said, taking a seat beside my father, "I need to understand something, Michelle. All these years when we've asked about your job, your life in the city, you've been lying to us?" The hurt in her voice was genuine, making me wince internally. In her framework, my privacy looked like deliberate deception rather than protective boundary setting. "I never lied about what mattered," I replied carefully. "When you asked if I was happy, if I was doing well, I always answered truthfully. I just didn't volunteer the full scope of my professional success." "But why?" she pressed. "What parent wouldn't want to know their child is thriving? Did you think we wouldn't be proud? That we wouldn't care? These were the difficult questions, the ones that required navigating decades of family dynamics without causing unnecessary pain. It wasn't about you not caring, I began, choosing my words with care. It was about how that caring was expressed. From childhood, there's been a pattern in our family. Jessica's achievements were celebrated publicly, discussed extensively. Mine were acknowledged briefly before conversation moved on. My mother's expression shifted toward defensiveness. That's not true. We've always been equally proud of both of you. I believe you felt equal pride, I acknowledged. But the expression of that pride, the attention given to our respective paths, was never balanced. Even now, you're concerned about Jessica's feelings, her identity being tied to the business, while my revelation about building a successful company from nothing is treated as secondary to how it impacts her. My mother opened her mouth to protest, then closed it again, a troubled look crossing her face. My father reached for her hand, squeezing it gently, a silent communication between them that I couldn't fully interpret. Your mother shows her concern differently for each of you, he said finally. She worries more vocally about Jessica because Jessica needs more visible support. She's always been more fragile than you. The characterization was accurate, but hearing it stated so plainly by my father was unexpected. In our family narrative, Jessica was the confident, charismatic leader, not someone requiring special handling due to fragility. We may have overdone it, my father continued, surprising me further. The attention, the praise. We saw how easily things came to Jessica socially, how much she thrived on recognition, and we fed that. Meanwhile, you were always so self-sufficient, so capable of navigating life on your own terms. Perhaps we took that strength for granted. My mother was watching him with an expression of mingled surprise and dismay, as if he was breaking some unspoken family rule by articulating these dynamics. James, she said quietly, I don't think this is productive right now. Michelle has presented a business proposal. Let's focus on that. It was her standard deflection technique, redirecting emotionally complex conversations toward more concrete, manageable topics. For once, I was inclined to agree with her approach. The immediate business situation needed resolution, and deeper family reckonings could come later. Mom's right, I said. We should focus on Donovan's hardware. The offer I've presented is time-sensitive not because I'm trying to pressure you, but because the business's financial situation is deteriorating rapidly. The longer we wait, the fewer options will remain viable. My father nodded, seemingly relieved to return to business matters. The purchase price is generous, he acknowledged. But I'm concerned about the employees. Some of them have been with us for decades. The acquisition plan includes retention of all current staff for a minimum 6-month evaluation period, I explained. Those who adapt well to the new systems and approaches would be offered permanent positions. For those near retirement or unable to transition, we'd provide severance packages significantly above industry standard. My mother's brow furrowed. And the Donovan name? The legacy your grandfather built? Would remain, I assured her. Rebranding would be minimal, emphasizing modernization while honoring the history and community connection. Donovan's hardware. And home is the working concept, maintaining continuity while signaling expanded offerings. My father leaned back, studying me with newfound respect. You've thought this through thoroughly. I have, I confirmed. This isn't an impulse decision or a power play. It's a carefully considered solution that preserves what matters: jobs, legacy, family financial security, while addressing the business realities. And Jessica? My mother asked, the concern in her voice unmistakable. What happens to her? It was the central question, the one that would likely determine whether they accepted my offer. Despite the business's decline under her leadership, Jessica remained the emotional center of our family system. Her reaction would influence everyone else's. That depends largely on Jessica, I replied honestly. The severance package would provide financial stability while she determines her next steps. If she's interested in remaining involved in some capacity, perhaps in community relations or vendor management, we could discuss possibilities that align with her strengths. But not as general manager, my father clarified. No, I confirmed. The business needs specialized expertise in digital integration and modern retail strategy. That would require new leadership. A heavy silence settled between us as they absorbed the implications. Their retirement security, the family legacy, and Jessica's professional future, all hanging in the balance of this decision. We need time, my mother said finally. It's overwhelming, Michelle. Finding out about your company, considering selling the business, it's a lot to process at once. I understand, I said, rising from my chair. Take the week to review everything, consult with your advisors. I'm available to answer any questions that arise. As I prepared to leave, my father struggled to his feet, waving away my mother's concerned hand. I'll walk you out, he said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a casual courtesy, but a deliberate choice. At the front door, he paused, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between regret and pride. Whatever happens with the business, he said quietly, I want you to know I'm proud of what you've built. Genuinely proud. The simple statement, delivered without qualification or comparison to Jessica, affected me more deeply than I had anticipated. Thank you, I managed, my voice rougher than I intended. That means a lot. As I drove away from my childhood home, I realized that regardless of their decision about the acquisition, something fundamental had already changed. For the first time in my adult life, my father had seen me, truly seen me, as the woman I had become rather than the shadow of the daughter he had always compared to his other daughter. Whether that recognition would extend to the rest of the family remained to be seen. The following days passed in a blur of activity. While waiting for my family's response to the acquisition offer, I threw myself into DriveSync's operations with renewed focus. The European partnership negotiations reached a critical phase, requiring late-night calls with our Munich counterparts and detailed technical discussions about implementation timelines. On Thursday afternoon, 3 days after the revelation to my family, I was reviewing security protocols with our IT director when Eliza knocked on my office door. Your sister's here, she said, her expression carefully neutral. She doesn't have an appointment, but she's quite insistent about seeing you. I set down my tablet, genuinely surprised. Jessica's here? At DriveSync? Eliza nodded. Waiting in the main conference room. Ryan is keeping her company. The slight emphasis on keeping suggested surveillance rather than hospitality. I'll be right there, I said, quickly organizing the documents on my desk. Did she say what this is about? Just that it's family business and couldn't wait, Eliza replied. Want me to join you? I considered the offer. Having Eliza present would provide both a witness and a strategic ally if Jessica had come to challenge the acquisition proposal. However, it might also signal defensiveness or lack of confidence in handling my own sister. No, but stay accessible, I decided. I'll text if I need reinforcement. The walk to the conference room gave me time to collect my thoughts. Jessica's unannounced visit could mean several things. An emotional confrontation, an attempt to negotiate different terms, or perhaps even acceptance of the offer. Her abrupt departure from Sunday's family dinner had been uncharacteristic, suggesting she was processing the revelations in ways I couldn't predict. When I entered the conference room, Jessica was standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city skyline. She turned at the sound of the door, her expression unreadable. Ryan, who had been making awkward small talk, looked relieved at my arrival. I'll let you two catch up, he said, nodding to me as he made his exit. Jessica took in my office attire, the custom-tailored blouse, designer watch, and the subtle confidence that came with being in my professional element rather than relegated to the role of younger sister. "Quite a setup you have here," she said, gesturing around the sleek conference room with its state-of-the-art technology and impressive views. "The executive floor of Parkview Tower. Not exactly middle management accommodations." "No," I agreed, simply not rising to the implied criticism of my past deception. "Would you like something to drink? Coffee? Water?" "I'm fine," she replied, moving away from the window to take a seat at the conference table. I joined her, maintaining a professional but non-confrontational demeanor. "I'm surprised to see you here," I said when it became clear she wasn't immediately volunteering the purpose of her visit. "We haven't had a chance to talk since Sunday." Jessica studied me for a moment, her expression shifting from guarded to something more complex. "I've spent the past 3 days trying to make sense of everything. The company you've built, the acquisition offer, the fact that my little sister has apparently been a secret tech mogul all these years while you've been what?" I prompted when she trailed off. "Living in a fantasy," she finished quietly, believing I could save the family business through sheer determination, despite all evidence to the contrary. The admission startled me. Jessica rarely acknowledged failure or miscalculation, preferring to reframe setbacks as temporary obstacles or external circumstances beyond her control. "The business challenges aren't entirely your fault," I offered, unsure how to navigate this unfamiliar vulnerability from her. "The retail landscape has shifted dramatically. Big box stores, online, competition. These are industry-wide disruptions." "Don't patronize me, Michelle," she said sharply, though without real anger. "I've spent the past 72 hours reviewing our financial statements with clear eyes for the first time in years. The patterns are obvious. I've been making the same mistakes repeatedly while expecting different results." She reached into her bag and pulled out the acquisition proposal I'd prepared, now heavily annotated with sticky notes and highlighting. "This offer is more than fair," she acknowledged. "The valuation, the employee provisions, even the severance package for me. It's all reasonable, possibly even generous given the current state of the business." I waited, sensing there was more coming. Jessica hadn't made an unannounced visit to my office merely to tell me she found my offer acceptable. "But before I recommend that Mom and Dad accept it," she continued, confirming my suspicion, "I need to understand something." She leaned forward slightly, her expression intent. "Why are you doing this? Really doing this? Is it about saving the family legacy? Protecting the employees? Or is it about finally proving you were always the smarter Donovan?" The directness of the question deserved an equally direct answer. "It's not about proving anything," I said carefully. "It's about finding the best solution to a complex problem. The business is failing, but it still has value in its community relationships, its loyal customer base, its brand history. With proper management and strategic investment, it can thrive again. That benefits everyone, our parents, the employees, even you." "But why you?" she pressed. "With a $20 million tech company to run, why take on a struggling hardware chain? You could just let it fail and offer Mom and Dad financial support afterward. Clean, simple, no business entanglements." It was a perceptive question, one that cut to the heart of motivations I hadn't fully articulated even to myself. "Because it matters," I admitted after a moment. "Not just to our parents, but to me. I grew up in those stores. I learned about business watching Grandpa interact with customers, tracking inventory with Dad on Sunday afternoons, listening to vendor negotiations. Those experiences shaped who I am professionally, even if my path led in a different direction." Jessica studied me, searching for hidden agendas or manipulations in my expression. Finding none, she nodded slowly. "I believe you," she said, sounding almost surprised by her own conclusion. "Which makes what I'm about to propose even more difficult." She pulled another document from her bag. This one a presentation folder, with the logo of a regional home improvement chain I recognized as Homebase. a mid-sized competitor. 2 months ago, Homebase approached me about acquiring Donovan's, she revealed. I didn't tell Mom and Dad because I couldn't bear to admit how dire our situation had become. Their initial offer was insultingly low, barely enough to cover our outstanding debt. But yesterday, after reviewing your proposal, I reached out to them again. She pushed the folder toward me. They've substantially improved their offer in response to news of a competing bid. It's still below your price, but it comes with guaranteed management positions for me and Robert, plus a consulting contract for Dad during the transition. I opened the folder, quickly scanning the terms. The purchase price was approximately 20% lower than my offer, but the management provisions were indeed substantial. A 5-year contract for Jessica at a salary higher than what she currently drew from the struggling business. You're telling me this because, I asked, wanting her to articulate her position clearly. Because I'm at a crossroads, she replied, surprising me again with her candor. The smart business decision, the one that benefits our parents most financially, is to accept your offer. But the path that preserves my professional identity, my role in the community as a Donovan, that's the Homebase option. She leaned back in her chair, looking suddenly tired. So here I am, asking my little sister, the one I've underestimated and probably mistreated for years, which path I should choose. The one that's best for our parents or the one that's best for me? Because for the first time, those aren't the same thing. The vulnerability of her position struck me forcefully. Jessica, who had always been so certain of her place in our family and in the business, was now openly acknowledging the conflict between her self-interest and our parents' welfare. Moreover, she was asking for my guidance, something that had never happened in our adult relationship. The moment felt pivotal, laden with possibilities for either healing or deepening the rift between us, depending on how I responded. I studied the Homebase offer more carefully, considering the implications. Their proposed management structure would essentially maintain Jessica's position and status while injecting capital into the failing business. On paper, it seemed like a viable alternative that would address her primary concerns. Yet something about the offer felt off. I flipped to the financial projections and immediately spotted the issue. Homebase was planning significant staff reductions after the first year, disguised in the appendix as operational efficiencies. The community focus that had defined Donovan's hardware would be stripped away. The stores likely converted to the Homebase model within 18 months. Have you read the full proposal? I asked, pointing to the relevant section. Page 14, paragraph 3. They're planning to terminate at least 60% of the current staff once the transition period ends. Jessica frowned, taking the document back and scanning the section I'd indicated. I focused on the executive summary and management provisions, she admitted. They assured me they valued the Donovan team. They value the customer relationships and market position, I corrected. Not necessarily the people who built those relationships. Her expression fell as she continued reading. And the Westridge location would be closed entirely after 2 years, she noted, identifying another, buried provision. That's our original store, the one Grandpa started. I watched as the realization dawned on her. The Homebase offer wasn't about preserving Donovan's legacy, but about eliminating a competitor and absorbing their market share with minimal long-term investment. They're not partners, she said slowly. They're predators. Most acquisitions in struggling sectors are, I replied, not unkindly. Their responsibility is to their shareholders, not to the Donovan family history. Jessica closed the folder with a decisive motion. I can't recommend this to Mom and Dad, not when I understand what it really means. She looked up at me, a new resolution in her expression. But that leaves your offer as the only viable option. Not necessarily, I said, an idea forming as I spoke. There might be a third path. What do you mean? I leaned forward, energy building as the concept crystallized. What if, instead of a complete acquisition, we structure this as a strategic partnership? DriveSync provides the capital investment and technological expertise, while maintaining the Donovan family involvement in key areas. Jessica's expression shifted from resignation to cautious interest. What kind of involvement? You've always excelled at customer relationships and community engagement, I said, acknowledging her genuine strengths. What if, instead of a general manager position that requires financial and operational expertise you don't enjoy, you took on a role focused specifically on those elements? Director of Community Relations and Customer Experience, perhaps. And the operational side? She asked, immediately grasping the implications. Would be handled by professional retail management with specific experience in modernizing traditional businesses. They would report to a board that includes both of us, giving you continued voice in major decisions without the day-to-day burden of areas outside your interest and expertise. Jessica was quiet for a moment, considering. I'd still be part of Donovan's, but in a role better suited to my actual skills, she summarized. While you bring in the expertise we've been lacking. Exactly. It preserves family involvement and legacy while addressing the business realities. She studied me, a complex mix of emotions crossing her face. Why would you offer this? After years of being sidelined, of watching me run the business into the ground while ignoring your input, why give me any role at all? It was a fair question, one that required honest reflection. Part of me, the part still smarting from years, of being overlooked and undervalued, had initially envisioned a complete takeover, a definitive demonstration of my business acumen versus Jessica's. But that approach would only perpetuate the competitive dynamic that had defined our relationship for too long. Because a clean break isn't always the healthiest solution, I said finally. For the business, for our family, or for us. This approach acknowledges both our contributions, your years of commitment and community building, my resources and strategic vision. Jessica absorbed this, then asked the question that cut to the heart of our relationship. Can we actually work together? Michelle, really work together given our history? It was the pivotal question, the one that would determine whether my proposal was merely theoretical or practically viable. Our past interactions offered little evidence for optimism. Yet something had shifted in the past few days. Jessica sitting in my office, acknowledging her limitations, considering options beyond her own immediate benefit. I think we can, I said, surprising myself with my conviction. Not because our past conflicts have magically disappeared, but because we're entering this with clearer understanding of ourselves and each other. You know my capabilities now. I recognize your genuine strengths. We both care about the family legacy, just in different ways. Jessica nodded slowly, a tentative smile forming. The brilliant tech CEO and the community-focused Donovan face. Different strengths, common goal. Exactly. She extended her hand formally across the table. I'd like to present this alternative to Mom and Dad. Together, if you're willing. I shook her hand, feeling something shift and settle between us. Not a complete healing of old wounds, but a first step toward a more authentic relationship built on mutual respect rather than family mythology. Together, I agreed. After Jessica left, I remained in the conference room, processing what had just occurred. The conversation had taken a turn I couldn't have predicted, opening possibilities I hadn't considered in my initial planning. The revised approach would require additional legal and financial structuring, but it felt right in a way my original acquisition proposal hadn't. Eliza appeared in the doorway, curiosity evident in her expression. Everything okay? Your sister looked different when she left, less hostile than when she arrived. Things are shifting, I confirmed. We're exploring a partnership structure instead of a complete acquisition. Eliza raised an eyebrow. You're going to work with your sister? The same sister who, according to years of your stories, has consistently undermined and dismissed you? People can change, I said, though I understood her skepticism. Or at least, relationships can evolve when circumstances force new perspectives. True, she acknowledged, taking a seat. But are you sure this isn't just another family pattern playing out? You compromising to keep the peace while Jessica gets what she wants? The question gave me pause. Eliza knew me well enough to identify my blind spots, particularly regarding family dynamics. Was I unconsciously falling back into established roles despite the apparent breakthrough? I don't think so, I said, after careful consideration. This feels different. Jessica came here to my territory. She acknowledged the business realities and her own limitations. That's unprecedented. And you trust this change is genuine? Trust is a process, I replied. But for the first time, I'm seeing Jessica as a complex person rather than just my perfect sister, someone with real strengths and genuine insecurities, someone capable of growth. Eliza studied me, then nodded slowly. Just be careful that this partnership has clearly defined boundaries and expectations. Family businesses get messy precisely because personal dynamics bleed into professional decisions. We'll have everything formally structured and documented, I assured her. This won't be based on handshakes and family goodwill. After Eliza left, I opened my laptop and began outlining the new approach. The partnership structure would require careful design to leverage Jessica's genuine skills while providing the professional management necessary for revitalization. It would be more complex than a straightforward acquisition, but potentially more beneficial for all involved, preserving family connection to the business while introducing needed expertise and capital. As I worked, I realized I was energized in a way I hadn't anticipated. The prospect of transforming not just the family business but the family relationships themselves offered a different kind of challenge than building Drive Sync had been. No less demanding, but perhaps more personally meaningful. My phone buzzed, with a text from my father. Your mother and I have been talking about your offer. Jessica mentioned she met with you today and that you're considering a different approach. Can we meet this weekend to discuss? I replied affirmatively, suggesting Saturday at their house. A second text arrived moments later. Proud of both of you for finding common ground. Looking forward to hearing the details. The simple message affected me more deeply than I had expected. My father's acknowledgement of both Jessica and me, without comparison or qualification, felt like a small but significant shift in our family's emotional ecosystem. For the first time in years, I found myself looking forward to a family meeting, rather than approaching it with resignation or defensive preparation. Whatever the outcome of the business discussions, something fundamental had already changed. The possibility of authentic connection had opened where before there had been only entrenched patterns and unspoken resentments. As I left the office, that evening, the city skyline glowing in the sunset, I felt a sense of cautious optimism. The path ahead wasn't clear or simple, but it offered the possibility of integration, rather than continued separation between my professional success and my family relationships. After years of maintaining rigid boundaries between these aspects of my life, the prospect of selective, controlled merging felt both terrifying and liberating. This, I realized, was the true decision point. Not just about business structures or financial arrangements, but about the kind of relationship I wanted with my family moving forward. The revelation of my success had forced a recalibration of old patterns. Now came the more challenging work of building something new and healthier in their place. Saturday morning arrived with unexpected nerves fluttering in my stomach. Despite my professional accomplishments, negotiating multi-million-dollar contracts, presenting to boards of directors, managing a growing company through multiple phases of expansion, the prospect of this family meeting left me feeling unusually on edge. I had spent Friday working with my legal team to draft the partnership structure, creating a framework that would provide clear roles, responsibilities, and boundaries. The resulting document was comprehensive without being overly complex, balancing business necessities with family considerations. Rather than my usual casual weekend attire for family visits, I opted for business casual, acknowledging the professional nature of our discussion while avoiding the formal suit that might create unnecessary distance. The balance felt symbolic of the new relationship I hoped to establish: professional respect within a family context. When I arrived at my parents' house, Jessica's car was already in the driveway. I gathered my documents and laptop, taking a moment to center myself before approaching the front door. This meeting would set the tone for our family's future interactions, both personal and professional. My mother answered the door, her expression a mixture of tension and hope. "Michelle," she greeted me with a quick embrace. "Everyone's in the dining room. We thought we'd start with coffee and discussion before lunch." The dining room had been arranged more formally than our typical family gatherings. Documents were stacked neatly at each place setting, legal pads and pens perfectly aligned. My father sat at the head of the table, looking better than he had the previous weekend. More color in his face, his posture more upright. Jessica and Robert were already seated on one side, Jessica's expression carefully neutral, while Robert offered a small nod of greeting. "Good morning," I said, taking my seat opposite Jessica and Robert. "Thank you for making time for this discussion." "Before we begin," my father said, his tone more formal than usual, "I want to acknowledge that this past week has been transformative for our family. Learning about your success with DriveSync, Michelle, considering the future of the hardware business, it's forced us all to re-examine assumptions and expectations." My mother poured coffee for everyone, her hands steady despite the emotional weight of the conversation. "What matters most," she added, "is that we move forward in a way that honors both the business legacy and our family relationships." It was a surprisingly balanced opening, suggesting that my parents had done significant reflection since our previous meeting. I glanced at Jessica, wondering if she had influenced this framing. She met my eyes briefly, giving a small nod that I interpreted as confirmation. "Jessica mentioned that you two have discussed an alternative to the full acquisition," my father continued. "We'd like to hear about that first if you're ready to present it." I opened my laptop, connecting it to the small projector I'd brought. "We are," I confirmed. "What we're proposing is a structured partnership that preserves family involvement while addressing the business challenges." As the presentation appeared on the dining room wall, I began outlining the key elements of the partnership model. The business would be restructured into a new corporate entity, Donovan Family Enterprises, with two operating divisions: Donovan's Hardware and Home, the retail operation, and DriveSync Technologies, remaining separate but under the shared family holding company. The ownership structure would allocate 60% to me, reflecting my capital contribution and DriveSync's value, with 25% to my parents as founding family members and 15% to Jessica based on her years of service and continued involvement. The key difference from the acquisition proposal, I explained, moving to the next slide, is in the management structure and family roles. Jessica leaned forward slightly. "I'd transition from general manager to director of community relations and customer experience," she explained, taking over this portion of the presentation with a smoothness that suggested we'd rehearsed together, though in reality, we'd simply discussed the general approach. "This leverages my connections in the community and knowledge of our customer base while bringing in professional retail management for the operational aspects I've struggled with." My father's eyebrows rose slightly at Jessica's forthright acknowledgement of her limitations, something that would have been unthinkable just weeks ago. "And you, Michelle?" my mother asked. "What would your role be?" "I would chair the board of directors for the parent company, providing strategic oversight while maintaining my primary focus on DriveSync," I explained. "The retail operation would have a professional CEO with extensive experience in modernizing traditional businesses. I have several potential candidates already identified." Robert spoke up for the first time. What about the financial projections? The hardware business has been operating at a loss for nearly 2 years. I appreciated the direct question. The investment capital would address the immediate debt concerns and provide runway for the transformation, I said, advancing to the financial projections. Based on our analysis, with proper inventory management and digital integration, we project a return to profitability within 12 to 18 months. For the next hour, we walked through the details of the proposal: governance structure, decision-making processes, financial commitments, and transition timelines. My parents asked thoughtful questions, probing potential weaknesses and clarifying ambiguities. Jessica contributed meaningfully to the discussion, demonstrating her deep knowledge of vendor relationships and community dynamics while deferring to me on financial and technological elements. The collaborative nature of our presentation seemed to reassure my parents that this wasn't merely a theoretical arrangement, but a workable partnership between siblings who had found a way to value each other's strengths. This is remarkably comprehensive, my father said when we finished the formal presentation. You've clearly put significant thought into balancing business necessities with family considerations. We have, Jessica confirmed, glancing at me. Michelle's business acumen combined with my community knowledge creates something stronger than either of us could offer independently. The simple acknowledgement of my abilities, spoken without qualification or resentment, marked a profound shift in our sibling dynamic. I nodded in appreciation, recognizing that her willingness to publicly affirm my strengths was as significant as my inclusion of her in the partnership structure. 6 months after that pivotal meeting, the transformation of both Donovan's hardware and our family dynamics had progressed beyond what any of us might have imagined. The business had not only stabilized but begun to thrive under its new structure. The renovated stores showed consistent growth in both customer traffic and sales. The online platform we'd developed, something my father had long resisted, now accounted for nearly 20% of total revenue. Christine, the retail executive we'd hired, had proven herself an exceptional CEO, skillfully balancing respect for tradition with necessary innovation. She had gained the trust of longtime employees while attracting new talent with specialized skills in digital marketing and inventory optimization. Under her leadership, Donovan's was evolving into a model of how traditional family businesses could successfully adapt to changing market conditions. Jessica had flourished in her role as Director of Community Relations and Customer Experience. Freed from the operational and financial responsibilities that had never aligned with her natural strengths, she focused her energy on building relationships and creating the personalized shopping experience that distinguished Donovan's from big-box competitors. Her workshop series had become so popular that we had expanded the community event space in the flagship store to accommodate larger groups. Our professional partnership had gradually fostered a more authentic personal relationship as well. The weekly business meetings often extended into dinner conversations that ranged beyond work to include family matters, shared interests, and occasionally even the careful excavation of old misunderstandings. We weren't best friends. Too many years of established patterns remained. But we had developed a genuine appreciation for each other's qualities and contributions. My parents had visited during the grand reopening of the original store. My father, touring the renovated space with visible pride. You and Jessica have done something remarkable here, he told me as we walked through the flagship location. You've honored the legacy while creating something new. That's a difficult balance to achieve. The acknowledgement meant more coming after he had seen the results firsthand, not just financial reports or secondhand descriptions, but the tangible evidence of successful transformation. On a crisp autumn evening, almost exactly 1 year, after the initial family confrontation about Donovan's Hardware's fate, I found myself standing with Jessica on the observation deck of DriveSync's headquarters, looking out over the city lights. Did you ever imagine we'd end up here? She asked, her tone suggesting not just surprise but something closer to wonder. Working together? Building something meaningful from what started as a crisis? No, I admitted. But I'm glad we did. Me, too, she said, surprising me with her directness. Not just for the business, though that's exceeded all projections, but for us. For finding a way to be sisters rather than rivals. For breaking the patterns. As we stood there in companionable silence, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point. What had begun with conflict and revelation, the dramatic disclosure of my secret success, the confrontation over the failing family business, had evolved into something neither of us could have anticipated. A genuine partnership built on mutual respect and complementary strengths. It wasn't perfect resolution. No family achieves that mythical state. But it was authentic healing, the kind that acknowledges past wounds while creating space for new, healthier patterns to emerge. And in both business and family terms, that represented a return on investment far more valuable than any financial measure could quantify. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.